podcasting from a little cabin on a hill. This is the Stacy Westfall podcast. Stacy's goal is simple: to teach you to understand why horses do what they do, as well as the action steps for creating clear, confident communication with your horses.
Hello, I'm Stacy Westfall, and I teach people how to understand, enjoy, and successfully train their own horses. In this first season of the podcast, I'm going to be discussing issues that frequently affect the way that riders think. One of the tools that I use to help people understand issues that they're having is something that I created that I call the 4-square model. The purpose of the model is to simplify complex problems, to break them down into smaller actionable pieces. The model's pretty easy to understand. If you took a piece of paper and drew a plus sign, you could actually create it on your own. And the 4 sections that would go in each one of those 4 quadrants would be the rider's mind, the rider's body, the horse's mind, and the horse's body. I'll put an illustration of this in the show notes for the podcast, which you can find at stacywestfall.com. The reason I think it's important to break issues down into these 4 different categories is it makes it a lot easier to figure out the next area you need to address. In this season of the podcast, I'm going to be focusing on the rider's mind. In today's episode, I'll be discussing fear and how it's different from danger and some of the ways that it affects riders. Fear is something that I think people frequently confuse with danger. And the quickest way to keep those two separated in your mind for the purposes of this discussion is that fear is going to be something that you experience in your mind. For example, if you were going to do public speaking and you had a fear of public speaking, there would be no physical danger to public speaking. The stress and the negative experience you would have that you would label fear would be happening in your mind. Danger, on the other hand, I think gets combined with fear, but for this discussion, we're going to put danger, meaning you could be actually in physical danger. And we're going to actually save a lot of the questions that revolve around riding and physical danger for a different episode. So today, we're just going to discuss fear. And to get us all on the same page, I'd like to just go ahead and jump in and read an example that I got through an email from a woman named Melanie, who wrote to me after receiving one of my weekly emails. And she said, "I have 2 wonderful horses I've owned for many years. They've never taken a wrong step. I've had a couple surgeries over the last 2 years. I'm terrified of getting back on. Not of getting hurt, but of not having the seat and balance anymore. I'm scared of not being able to communicate clear aids to my horse. Riding was second nature. My horse was just an extension of my legs. I'm scared it won't be that way anymore. There's grass growing in my arena." I think that email pretty well illustrates what I'm talking about, the idea that fear is happening in your mind. And there is a reality to how it ties together, but for the purposes of this, I want to get you to think about what is going on when you experience this type of fear and anxiety around an issue, such as getting back on and thinking you're going to have a different riding experience. And I think that what happens with people is that they often think that if the experience isn't what they wanted it to be, so they want this experience to be as easy as it was before. They want this experience to turn out in a positive way. I think, like if the public speaking comes up again, I think people are afraid of public speaking because if they had a guaranteed outcome of success, then there wouldn't be as much fear. There might still be that feeling in your body of, increased heart rate or sweaty palms when you get up there. But the interesting thing about that is those can also be signs of excitement. So if you were a little kid waiting for Christmas, heart racing, inability to sleep, those kind of things would have been very similar to the expressions that we label fear, but it would have actually been excitement. And I think the reason that it's important to break apart some of these things, like for example, fear from danger, is that if we leave it all muddled up and mixed up in our minds, it makes it more difficult to actually stop and look at what's going on. So in Melody's example, it's very possible that she won't have the same experience that she had before. But I could say the same thing about me riding a horse if I took any amount of time off or even just going out there. I mean, there's no guarantee that it's always going to be exactly the same. Something can happen to one or the other of us. Situations can change. And in a way, we just have to accept the fact that it might not always be this peak experience, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be a bad experience or a less experience. And there's something about letting fear hold you down that is really kind of depressing, because realistically, what happens is you're guaranteeing that you won't achieve what you're most yearning for. I'm going to read another example from another email. I've not ridden a horse in over a year, but I still care and provide for my 3. A major part of my life is missing, and I'm ready to begin again. I've cleaned my tack, set up my round pen, and have started to get back in shape physically. In all honesty, I'm terrified, not of getting hurt. I'm afraid of failing, of not knowing what I'm doing. I'm afraid of the relationships I will develop with my pasture puffs. I feel like I've never done this before. I keep putting things off. And I think what comes across clearly when you read this from an outside perspective is that the very fear of failing is preventing people from trying. And when fear stops you from even trying, then you've already lost. You're guaranteed loss because you didn't even try. If you really want to do something, if you really want to play the game, if that game is, in this example, riding a horse, or in my example, starting a podcast, we can't control the outcome of many of these things. But if this fear of not having a guaranteed experience is stopping us, then we are actually guaranteeing ourselves pain. And I think that I know, at least in my experience, it's often easier to choose the pain that we can control. So let's bring it back to this podcasting. I've been wanting to do a podcast for a very long time. And it's super easy for me to wrap a lot of different things up in it. I can say that I've got reservations about the technology, or the amount of time it's going to take, or what I'm going to talk about. But probably the biggest one is how it's going to be received. And so by simply letting the fear of how it's going to be received stop me, I'm guaranteeing that I will never get to play the game of podcasting. And so at that point, I have a choice. And I wish I could say that one choice or the other would be guaranteed to be pain-free. Meaning that I could sit on the sidelines and not podcast and it would be pain-free. But realistically, if I'm really yearning to do a podcast, then there's going to be some level of discomfort in not doing it. But picking up the microphone and choosing to do it also does not mean I will not encounter difficulties or challenges, or maybe even some of my own real fears coming true. But at the end of the day, if that happens, 2 things. 1, I'll know I tried. And 2, most likely I'll live through it, because this is an emotional, mental fear. Because if nobody listens to the podcast, or people write in and say that they hate it, I can live through that. I might not enjoy it. There might be a little bit of pain. But at the end of the day, it's better than not trying at all. I think it's important to remember that we've all seen the movies and we've all read the books, and it seems like sometimes we're just looking for these little grains of motivation that will help us move forward. Because for some of us, that might be simply going out and being willing to try again. The one email, I had shortened it, and the reason she was so fearful of her pasture puffs was because she lost a horse she really loved. So, it might be somebody listening who's afraid of exposing themselves to that type of pain again. Or you could be out there listening and you could be considering showing your horse for the first time. And you know that there's a really good chance you're going to make mistakes, because I do it still when I try a different discipline. I'm probably going to make mistakes because it's one of the greatest ways to learn is by making mistakes. And that's what happens when you go out and try something new that's really out of your comfort zone. Or maybe you're just yearning to actually, push yourself to be more consistent. And maybe you're even riding horses and you want this to be a profession, but you're afraid who in the world would ever bet on you. And what I'd like to do in this podcast is be able to show you that other people are experiencing these things. I've experienced these things. And let's start a conversation around this. So here's an interesting thought to wrap up with. When we are training horses, we often strive to teach our horses to turn and face their fears. Literally. We try to teach them to turn if we're flapping a plastic bag around, stop running, turn, and look back at the plastic bag that we're shaking. And we do this because we want them to realize that not all fear equals danger. And that's the same thing for us. Not all fear equals danger. When you can remember that fear is different than danger, you can actually stop and think about what's holding you back right now. And the challenge as I leave you is to answer the question, what is one step you could take to face your fear? If you can't think of one simple step to face your fear, I would encourage you to jump over to the show notes of this podcast and just simply type your fear out in the comment section and say, I have a fear of blank. And that would actually be one small step towards moving past that fear. You'll find that over at stacywestfall.com. Thank you.
If you enjoy listening to Stacy's podcast, please visit stacywestfall.com for articles, videos, and tips to help you and your horse succeed.